What the low carb community then does, oftentimes, is they take and they say, okay, well, because the Journal of American College of Cardiology said we can loosen up the saturated fat guidelines away from this sort of like old Ansel Keys stricture, we're going to just now recommend protocols with gratuitous amounts of saturated fat. And we're going to tell people that's safe at any speed, which is just not, it's just not true. And there's people out there who hear this information, they see, okay, well, there's a certain subset of the low carb community that's saying, and I think they do this because being in ketosis feels really good mentally. It feels really good. People are developing all these odd food sensitivities. And for some people, a more animal-based diet is a good short-term fix for immune system reactivity. And so they say, oh, this is how I can quiet my immune system down. So don't tell me this is bad for me. I don't want to hear about your LDL cholesterol. I feel mentally better than I have in 10 years, kind of a thing. But there's not a recognition in those populations that there's a trade-off.
Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing. Hi, and welcome to Influence to Death. My name is Victoria Lafont, and we are back. My usual co-host, Hannah Wright, is off getting her master's in public health and chasing her son around. And so Amanda Jones is here with us again, thankfully, as guest co-host. Amanda, one of my friends described any co-host that I had has to be like the straight man because I'm such an absolute kook. And I think that's the role that you're playing is like the straight and narrow. And we're also really excited today to have guest John O'Connor of Gene Food. And John, we didn't discuss this beforehand. Do you want us to read your bio to give people an idea of who you are? Or would you rather kind of tell us a little bit?
You could, sure, if you'd like to. I mean, yeah.
Okay, cool. Some people are like really like extremely opposed to having their bio read. So he's the founder of a company. Would that be the best way to describe it?
Gene Food is a software business that scores genetic data for diet and health traits. So.
Yeah, and also it has an excellent blog that I've been reading over the past couple of weeks since Amanda taught me about your work, and in the past, a podcast, which I think is still worthwhile for people to go back and listen to. And John, you can chime in on that. So you founded Gene Food, and you are an integrative health coach, trained at Duke Integrative Medicine, but you didn't start in the health world. So you actually started in New York City in the startup world, which if people have ever been, I guess, on the West or East Coast, but I lived in Boston for years, I feel like the startup world on the East Coast is this like level of intensity that a lot of people can't really grasp until they've somewhat been in that world a little bit. And so in your bio, when you say that you were stressed, burned out, and physically sick, I was like, yeah, I can totally see how that would happen to somebody in that world. So then you wanted to understand about health and how your body works, and probably came to the same crossroads that all of us come to. It's not just a crossroads. It's like a crazy squirrel brain intersection of 1,000 different viewpoints and opinions. And then you started kind of looking around for more straight answers. So you talk about 3 mentors that you had. If people want to learn more about these folks, Mia Barbrick, Dr. Stephen Brody, and then you did a yoga teacher training. I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. Gerhard Gessner?
Yeah,
is that
Gerhard? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Got it. And really, it sounds like, what you eventually turn to is to look to genetics as a little bit more of a guide versus all of these differing opinions. But please speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was hanging out with Dr. Brody, who's an endocrinologist in San Diego, I would go out to San Diego, had some good friends in San Diego. And, when you're used to New York City, San Diego feels like the most park-like, sunny, calm place. I mean, it feels like you're in, it's incredible, the contrast, right? So, and I was hanging out with this guy who had access to a lot of sort of behind the velvet rope blood testing, and he we got access to a lot of LDL subfraction and advanced lipid panels, and he was running Boston Heart in his clinic. So we recommend Boston Heart to a lot of people at Gene Food because they run sterile panels, which we can get into in a little bit. But I was fascinated by the inclusion of genetic markers in the Boston Heart panels. Very advanced lab, and they had some MTHF, they had an MTHFR score, and they had some other, lipoprotein A and some of these other genetic markers. And I was just very interested at the time, and obviously still I'm operating Gene Food, but I was interested in how nutrients and the foods we eat can impact, the enzymatic function, the function of an expression of genes.
Mhm.
And that topic has become quite popular now with everybody talking about methylation and is a big one.
Yeah. We
And
just did
so
an episode on that, which I'm like, how much would we have to pay you for you to listen to that episode and then come talk to us about it?
people are so into it.
Yeah.
And we started just compiling, myself and some being in San Diego, there's a lot of biotech and really smart biotech people and some friends that I made. We created we started compiling nutrigenomic genetic markers. And that's what you see on the Gene Food website is the guide to nutrigenomics. So we started writing up and scoring out some of these different genetic markers and eventually compiled them into several different risk scores, one of which is our diet type. So it scores people into a diet type. And the focus of the diet type is cardiometabolic health. So
Mhm.
trying to tease out people who are going to have, a bad response to a diet that's high in saturated fat or, be able to tolerate more fat in their diet or, who may do better leaning into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats and may do better avoiding saturated fat, or who tend to hyperabsorb cholesterol and plant sterol, and all the fun little, ways that we can find individuality in our lipid response.
Mhm.
And I know that's what you guys want to, chat about today. So I'm excited to do that.
Yeah, and I just wanna add a little plug here. So the if I understand correctly, the podcast is no longer active in terms of producing new episodes, but it's still available in all the, podcasting streams, and it's still completely relevant. There are so many great interviews on there, but the actual software and website itself is very much still active and continues to be in active development and research. Is that true?
Yeah, and that's a great. I mean, God, maybe we should dust off the podcast for that reason. I wonder if people visit the. I did several episodes of the podcast, and as we mentioned, off the calls, like I did my final episode right before having kids, and where I kind of just said, I felt like the conversation was reaching a point of tribalism that made me a little bit uncomfortable, and it wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to be, immersed in every day.
Mhm.
But the business, in terms of how we're operating as a business, has only been improving, and what we're doing is always looking for ways to improve our scoring algorithms when new research emerges. So,
Mhm.
before I
Yeah.
got on the call with you, we added several new genes to our carbohydrate scoring. We're always looking at ways to improve the saturated fat scoring that we do. And so, no, Gene Food is very much still operational and something that we're working really hard to try to make as valuable as possible, for people that use it.
And I wanted to share that I have done several different third-party, software, genomic analytic tools to try to understand my own raw data, and, so Gene Food was the most recent one that I did, and I definitely got new and different insight, I think partly because of the cardiometabolic lens that you're using, but also the effort to kinda have this, like, summation of, okay, that, it's some level of polygenic risk scoring in this one domain of cardiometabolic health, and then pointing that to a specific diet pattern wasn't something I hadn't seen in any of the other software tools, and it really resulted in, like, a little bit more of a like, a practical application piece to the data, and to the outcome of that data analysis, and I have ApoE4, so I'm especially interested in lipidology and cardiometabolic health. So anyway, it was great. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot of new stuff about myself, and that kind of sent me on a wormhole into studying some more of the genes that affect cholesterol homeostasis and lipid management on that individual level. So anyway, it's great stuff. And I did want to clarify, like, Gene Food is still happening, because I know we're in a podcasting audience here, so they may go to look at that podcast and not be aware that it's still as active as it is, so
No, it's still happening, and I appreciate you saying that. And with ApoE4, that's one of the really interesting markers. that impacts our, fat scoring. So, in our algorithm, if you carry one copy of ApoE4, then that automatically bumps you down a fat tier. So we have a dietary fat score that has a compilation of genes that look at and try to tease out people that are going to have, like a hypersynthetic response to higher fat diets. So their body will start either making or absorbing more cholesterol, or maybe they clear less cholesterol, because we do have some PCSK9 variants in the scores. And ApoE4 is one where, we feel like it's well documented enough that people who carry these markers really do tend to make a lot more cholesterol when they go on high fat diets. And that's why they see their lipids get out of range. I mean, there's also evidence, that they tend to absorb more at the same time. You mentioned cholesterol homeostasis. Some of these, all these rules are all broken for some genotypes. And it's interesting to tease out and see, who's who, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm about to go to Gene Food and enter my raw data since learning about this.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I am the diet that was recommended was a low fat in general, but of course that's looking at high fiber, well balanced carbohydrate intake. It's not saying just go eat a bunch of sugar, but it is. I do have several things indicating that I may benefit long term from I might have significant risk reduction by limiting saturated fat in particular. And, I definitely come from this kind of, I think, a generation almost of nutrition geeks, but also professionals who were kind of like in the middle of this wave of trying to vindicate saturated fat and to push back against dietary guidelines that were recommending these general population-wide restrictions on both dietary cholesterol and dietary fat. And we kind of, I think some of us didn't slow down enough to ask about how different people are going to be responding to saturated fat in the diet. There's such a spectrum of how much is dietary saturated fat going to cause, dyslipidemia for you versus somebody else. And we just kind of went with this wave of countercultural enthusiasm of like, yes, we get to reclaim butter, and now we're using it for lotion, and we're putting it in everything, and we're making fat bombs. And now a lot of us are kind of, if we're practicing clinically or just paying attention to the research, we've had to kind of rein that back in with more nuance to say, actually, there is a cost benefit analysis here. There's going to be some trade-offs. So that kind of, I guess, gets us into low carb, high fat diet culture and research. And one of the topics that we want to talk about today, which is the whole lean mass hyper responder hypothesis, which is basically this kind of idea that's come from the low carb, high fat dieting world, that there is this kind of subgroup of people who are, when they go on a high fat, low carb diet, they're going to probably experience some benefits like improved insulin signaling and sensitivity, a reduction in glucose, reduction in triglycerides, reduction in some inflammatory markers, elevation in cardioprotective HDL cholesterol levels, but they will see this significant rise in their LDL cholesterol and ApoB particle number. But the argument in this group is that for this subgroup of insulin sensitive, kind of otherwise metabolically healthy people, that increase in LDL cholesterol and ApoB particle is not actually a sign of pathology. It's not coming from metabolic pathology. It's just simply there because their bodies are trafficking more lipids, because they're using more triglycerides for fuel. They're recycling and just having higher levels of these lipoproteins and serum lipids. And so their argument is that perhaps that's not pathogenic and actually doesn't confer an increased risk for atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. So this has been a really hot topic in recent months because there was also a recent study called, what was the actual name? The keto CTA study that was the is it plaque predicts
Plaque begets
plaques?
plaque. Yeah.
Yeah, ApoB does not. Where they were trying to basically come up with their first piece of science to kind of try to push back against what's actually this mountain of decades of research suggesting that LDL cholesterol, and in particular, really more so ApoB total exposure to ApoB particles is indeed atherogenic. So anyway, I'm sorry. I think I maybe kicked the ball a little bit too far down the field there with that, but just kind of introducing this idea of lean mass hyperresponders in general. Um, yeah, where should we dive into that topic?
I think you can start. No, I mean, I think you can start with eggs. So
Oh.
so you can start with eggs, right? And no, not and not in a bad way. You can start with eggs because the party line with eggs and cholesterol for a long time was, eggs are bad for you. Don't eat too many eggs. Eggs are gonna cause heart disease. And what we've actually found is that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in populations when it comes to cholesterol absorption. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation cholesterol homeostasis. So for most people, if they absorb more cholesterol, they tend to make less cholesterol. And so their levels stay tightly regulated. So a lot of the scare tactics around eggs for say 80% of the population was not it was overdone. It was overdone. It's not to say that some people are not hyperabsorbers. It's something I'm really interested in is who are the hyperabsorbers. But the thinking on cholesterol was partially debunked for a lot of people. And so what happened is, I
Yeah.
think you have people said, okay, well, you guys were wrong about eggs. There's really like this new paradigm here that's rooted in sound science that you don't necessarily have to be as careful with dietary cholesterol as you thought. And somehow that got saturated fat and beef and butter and all that kind of ride shared on top of the cholesterol debunking.
Because
And
Mm.
they
so
ride share in
people
food so much.
they
Yeah.
ride share in food very often. And so you have to give sort of the low carb side of the argument and say, well, yeah, I mean, okay, there was just this Wall Street Journal article about cytosterolemia, and some people do hyperabsorb the sterols, cholesterol and plant sterols in these foods, and so they have to be more careful. But as a general rule, that's something where, okay, that was overdone. And there's also, literature. One of the pieces of research or commentary that I think is most interesting that people can go look at is a couple of years ago, the Journal of American College of Cardiology published a state-of-the-art review. And they talked about how removing arbitrary upper limits on saturated fat consumption was necessary based on, the weight of the evidence. But there's two things that need to be understood when you hear that top line. The first thing is that they're talking about a 10% of daily calories from saturated fat strict limit. And they're citing studies that maybe have loosened that up, like MESA or the Minnesota coronary experiment or some of these others, Pure, that had their top tier of saturated fat in the study be maybe 13% or 14%, right? And so what the Journal of the American College of Cardiology is saying is, yeah, not everybody needs to necessarily limit saturated fat consumption at 10% of daily calories. It can be a little more liberal. Maybe it's 12%, maybe it's 14%, right? But no one is saying, and they also acknowledged that there's a group of people who are saturated fat sensitive, and that's the ApoE4 carriers. That's some of these people who have, FH, like these histories in their family of these issues. So they acknowledge that there are these things. What the low carb community then does oftentimes is they take and they say, okay, well, because the Journal of American College of Cardiology said we can loosen up the saturated fat guidelines away from this sort of like old Ansel Keys stricture,
Uh-huh.
we're going to just now recommend protocols with gratuitous amounts of saturated fat.
Uh-huh.
And we're
Uh-huh.
going to tell people that's safe at any speed, which is just not, it's just not true. And there's people out there who hear this information, they see, okay, well, there's a certain subset of the low carb community that's saying, and I think they do this because being in ketosis feels really good mentally. It feels really good. people are developing all these odd food sensitivities, and for some people, a more animal-based diet is a good short-term fix for
Mm,
immune system reactivity.
mhm,
And so they say, okay, this is how I can quiet my immune system down. So don't tell me this is bad for me. I don't want to hear about your LDL cholesterol. I feel mentally better than I have in 10 years, kind of a thing.
mhm.
But there's not a recognition in those populations that there's a trade-off. And the trade-off is if you push your LDL cholesterol, and really more importantly, we can talk about your ApoB, to these astronomical places, because you are a hyper responder, your body is making more cholesterol as a response to eating a diet that's high in saturated fat, you're at risk. Now, there's a lot of smoke in the functional medicine community going back many years that large, fluffy cholesterol is not dangerous. And really, you need to look at people who are dyslipidemic to the, triglyceride side of the fence, who have insulin resistance
And
and
small dents.
small dense LDL, VLDL, greater expression of some of these are particles that live longer in circulation, and so they're more dangerous. But what we can now unpack is that maybe on a particle for particle basis, small dense LDL is more, atherogenic than, large fluffy cholesterol. But at the end of the day, like there's not going to be a debunking of the deleterious nature of ApoB for people's cardiovascular health on a long time horizon. It's just it's pretty. I hate to say this because I like to think of individual response, and I like to think of how people can craft protocols that are, tailored to their unique physiology. And for some people, maybe the increased risk of heart disease is worth it because they feel so good on these
Right.
protocols. But to then go and kind of tell people that they're not at risk and that they can comfortably go on these diets with your LDL cholesterol, 90 milligrams per deciliter, 200 milligrams per deciliter,
Yeah,
and
it's
walk
good you're
around and say,
saying that because people see high on their blood test is like, I think like my LDL is around like 120, I mean,
Mhm.
even a
Yeah,
little higher than I'm comfortable with, but you're talking about like extremely high LDL.
yeah, there is this subset of that group who has become, I mean, just very, very adamant that LDL is not causal in heart disease in this. And you see it. I mean, you're just out of your local breakfast place, right? Maybe I do this because I'm in the nutrition world, but you see the people having steak and eggs for breakfast, right? And that steak and eggs for breakfast order could be that just that's their once a month where they're getting, that really delicious I mean, it's a delicious thing to eat, right? But you see it as when I see that, I flag ideological breakfasts. I'm like, that's somebody who that's ideology for breakfast. Like, no, I can eat steak and eggs. Didn't you know? Like, as long as my blood sugar markers look good, like I'm fine. And it's kind of like you're just like, dude, like there's very few people that can really eat that way. Um,
I think that point that you made of like, for some people, that risk may be acceptable. Well, maybe I will die of atherosclerosis. I have a higher chance of dying of atherosclerosis at 55 or 60 versus 70 or 75, but I'm willing to live with that because my health span is more, or my quality of life in the years that I'm alive is more important to me. I don't really need to extend my life. I'm willing to take that risk because I feel so much better following this diet. But the thing is so many people are not being clearly presented that risk so that they can make that informed decision. It's one thing when you're making that decision for yourself, but as this podcast speaks to, influenced to death, it's a completely different level of responsibility to be kind of glossing over that risk because of the other real benefits of these diets. Um, while you're influencing so many other people, whether you're a online influencer or you're a practitioner, like people need to know all the information that we have in order to make that risk benefit analysis for themselves as an individual. And I just don't think that they're getting that
and, and
enough.
but the, and it's a great point. But the thing is, the thing that's so sad about it, and this came out, we can talk about keto CTA, and you mentioned like this lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. Um, that moniker was actually first created by Dr. Tom Dayspring, who's really had a
Right.
moment the last few years.
Right.
He's been on the Peter Attia podcast. I've been lucky to chat with Dr. Dayspring, and he's been a real sort of like hugely public about his work in lipidology, and that lean mass hyperresponder term was kind of taken over by some people in the low carb community, which we can get into. But to your point, these interventions are often very, very, very easy to make healthier. So
There's a
you
middle
can
ground.
you
Mhm.
can eat a low carb diet. It's just be mindful of your ApoB. So the people that are on a low carb diet, it's like if they can tolerate like a low dose statin. I know people hear that word and it blows their mind. And I get
Not
it. Like
us, John. We love drugs.
I know, yeah, especially
We just
statins, right?
love what
They're so
works,
fun. You just want to
honestly.
go pop a, it's Friday, but you can take these. You can go take a statin. You can take bempedoic acid. You could try experimenting with Zetia. There's all these. There's all these different pharmaceutical options. You could even play around with, some nutraceuticals, right? But people don't, to Amanda's point, because they've been told there's no reason to, because
Mhm.
these biomarkers are to be ignored. And it's like, that is just that is not the legacy that I
No,
would
it's possible.
want to have is making those arguments.
Yeah, and
Can
even before we get to pharmaceuticals, there's so many things in terms of modifying the diet, adding a little bit more fiber, shifting your saturated fat to mono unsaturated and polyunsaturated fat ratios, adding in other protective things, starting before, like taking the cautionary principle before you start a new low fat, high carb keto diet, get a really comprehensive baseline so that you can track where these markers are moving, looking at other markers like thyroid status, estrogen levels, there's alcohol intake. There's so many different things that can affect it that you can, levers you can pull to try to help modify the risk and that elevation in ApoB in people who really are getting very important benefits from the ketogenic diet. But again, if we're not willing to acknowledge the risk, then we're not going to be
right,
applying
there's
those cautionary, yeah,
why would
principles in
you?
the first place or trying to modify the diet. Because the other thing is like, as we're trying to mentally reclaim and redeem and vindicate saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, what comes along with that oftentimes is this demonization of plant foods because I think there's the real fact some people have GI issues that cause them to have very adverse effects to dietary fiber and different plant compounds can be problematic for some groups because of some other underlying health condition. But then that all gets kind of blamed on the plant in the first place, I think, as a kind of like the plant being the causal, the enemy, what is it? What's that dude
Anti-nutrient?
that puts the shirts it's
Oh,
like
Celadino or something?
FUCK, kale or something on
Ugh,
Yeah,
t-shirts, and
I
you're
mean,
just like,
yeah.
the thing about Dr. Paul Saladino though is that he's stepped back a bit from full carnivore diet. He was the carnivore MD and he stepped back, not for like LDL reasons, just because I don't think he felt like great on a full carnivore diet. But he's also a brilliant marketer. So I actually have a lot of respect for Dr. Paul Saladino because
Great
he's
marketer.
killed it on. Look, I wouldn't follow his advice when it comes to diet and like your biomarkers, but his if I wanted to build like a great YouTube channel, I'd go want to sit and be a fly in the wall because that guy has just absolutely killed it with his YouTube presence and the stuff he does. But if you're talking about the risk though, right? So let's talk about the risk.
Here,
Let's set
wait,
the table.
time out real
Oh,
quick.
sorry.
I just want to
Okay.
make sure, John, that I want to put this paper in the show notes.
Okay.
It's like a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations by the Journal of American, is it, you said cardiology?
Journal of the American College of Cardiology. It's a
College
state
of,
of the art review. I think it was the 2000. It's either the 2020 or 2022 state of the art review, and
okay.
it's quoted quite often by Nina Teicholz when she's talking about removing all
mhm.
limits on
Yeah.
consumption of saturated fat. When you look in, what you're really talking about is you're talking about a saturated fat budget. You're talking
Mm-hmm.
about basically, it's like, just everybody has a budget that they're on in terms of how much money they're spending on things. What's your budget for housing? What's your budget for entertainment? What's your budget for gas or whatever? It's the
Mm-hmm.
same with saturated fat. The trick is to understand that like you probably don't have an unlimited budget. It's very few people that have an unlimited budget. So figure out what your budget is, where you want to spend that saturated fat budget. Do you really enjoy, your whole milk and your latte in the morning? Okay, well then you want to be stricter down the line and make sure that you're not again, if you're a hyper responder, right? And and you're seeing your LDL increase, your ApoB increase on these diets, then you just want to be mindful of that, so that you can, as Amanda has well said, so that you can manage risk going forward. We can talk about the keto CTA study just to give people an idea if you want.
I
Well,
do,
there's one
but can
other
we
point
do?
that I want to like bring up really quickly, which is I think when we talk about like people, there's like the two sides. Like if they did actually know all of the risks, maybe they would still choose, to eat an extremely high fat, low carb diet and take on the risk because they feel so good. We don't have to spend a long time on this, but I think I don't think they would actually. So just like philosophically, I want to push back on that a little bit. I'm not saying like you're wrong or like that, Amanda, but like I think there is a place where people like see on social media, or like I see tons of like younger populations adopting these more extreme diets versus older populations. And I think maybe just from having like clinical experience or working with people that are in populations where they actually do have lived experience of a stroke or a heart attack, or like actually losing their quality of life or their life from, these effects, then it's like the perspective could be changed. But it's like you look, Paul Saladino is a perfect example. He's like has a beautiful body and fit, and I can't remember there's another like carnivore doctor who's like muscly, and it's like if that's what you see all the time and then you feel great, I think people are making decisions based on that versus like I saw a client, in his 70s and he's had 2 strokes, and it's like to see the impact I think is a lot different. I do wonder if people would actually
Yeah,
make that choice.
I think that humans are just unfortunately very we have a weakness when it comes to modifying behavior based on theoretical future risk. It's why
Horrible at it.
we
Yeah.
build on the Cascadian fault zone.
Yeah.
It's why we're not addressing climate change more proactively. There's so many examples on the collective level and individual level of just like, it's really hard to be like, well, I feel good and look better now. Somebody's
Mhm.
telling me that there's this kind of risk down the road, but it's really
Maybe.
difficult for me to change my behavior based on that. Um, John, I do want you to talk more risk, and I'm just wondering if you wouldn't be able to kind of like, let's go rewind to the beginning of this conversation. And, as you start to talk about risk and even the keto CTA study, could you give us a little bit of a, a primer, a little clarification on what exactly we're talking about when we say ApoB? Like, what is an apolipoprotein? Why does the specific type of apolipoprotein matter in terms of the progression of atherosclerosis? And what's the difference between LDL-C and ApoB? Why is it a problem for us to conflate those terms?
Yeah, and so I'm going to give one of the catalysts for me learning this was Peter Attia did the Straight Dope on Cholesterol, which is a great series, and he did a bunch of podcast interviews with Tom Dayspring, and those guys have done really a lot to sort of democratize. Myself, like I became really interested in lipidology and just kind of nerded out on it for several years, but I would credit especially those two guys for really doing a great job of sort of like teasing out these very complex issues. So apolipoprotein B is for every one LDL particle, there's one ApoB carrier protein. So ApoB is the carrier protein that's responsible for trafficking lipids, through the vasculature, because essentially you need to get you need it's that cholesterol is hydrophobic, and you need a protein that's hydrophilic, which can basically move the cholesterol like through the vasculature. So it's ApoB that's the taxi, and the cholesterol kind of gets on board with this protein. So what's the difference between LDL cholesterol and ApoB? They're similar but different. ApoB is this. It measures the sum total of all of your atherogenic lipoproteins. So not only does LDL need an ApoB protein to traffic through the vasculature, so does VLDL, so does IDL, so does lipoprotein A, because there's all these different LDL subclass. There's different characters on that stage. It's not just LDL is not the only type of ship that's moving its way through, through the vasculature. It's also these others. And so you can also measure like non-HDL cholesterol. Some people will use that as a proxy marker for ApoB. So, ApoB is just meant to capture all of the bad actors in your body that can be moving through and trafficking in lipids and doing bad things to your artery wall.
They're able to, the protein allows that particle to move in between the endothelial cells that line the vascular wall and actually penetrate into the subendothelial space and potentially become oxidized there, be retained in that vascular wall, and eventually form these kind of pools where you get immune cells coming in, you form these fatty streaks, eventually plaques, and that leads to atherosclerosis. So it's the unique ability of that ApoB transport protein to penetrate and be retained in the vascular wall that's so key here.
Yeah, and it's because the cholesterol is not going anywhere on its own. It's just like, we're not walking to, New York. We're going to take a plane, right? So it's like the ApoB is what moves these. It's not just cholesterol, it's also plant sterol and, triglycerides. And so it's like, well, why can't you just measure LDL? Well, you could have a situation where, like, for example, oftentimes I've heard it described as the Tim Russert phenotype. So Tim Russert was this old newsman. He wasn't old, but he was a beloved newsman at NBC News for a long time. And he died tragically of a heart attack. And when he died of a heart attack, he had very low LDL cholesterol. Well, you can have high ApoB, but low LDL cholesterol because you have cholesterol depleted particles and triglyceride rich particles, right? So you could have a situation where you have metabolic syndrome, your LDL cholesterol has been and your cholesterol synthesis has been driven very low based on being put on a statin, but you're still dyslipidemic to the triglyceride side of the fence because you are a phenotype that is seeing your body is not utilizing carbohydrate and sugar properly. It's turning that unused glucose and sugar into triglycerides, and that sugar is being trafficked with these LDL subparticles like VLDL, which is central to the Feldman energy model theory. So you have very high VLDL activity, very triglyceride-rich particles, and you can have a discordance between your LDL cholesterol and your ApoB. So what you're always looking for is the ApoB as the governing biomarker because it shows you your sum total of your risk. There are cases, they're rare. Usually LDL and ApoB match up, but when they don't match up, it can be because somebody has issues with type 2 diabetes, triglycerides, etc.
LDL
And that's still
receptors.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the way I explain it to students is kind of a shipping analogy. And of course, every analogy in this field is oversimplified because it's so complex the deeper you go. But I think of shipping, if I have cargo that I want to ship across the ocean, I've got 100 pounds of cargo. That's my cholesterol esters, my phospholipids, my triglycerides, all these lipids, all these fat soluble compounds. That's the cargo that's going to be placed onto these particles. But I have the option when I'm going to go ship this cargo across the ocean, I have the option to contract out 100 different kayaks to ship it across the ocean, or I can put it on a couple of big ocean liners and ship it across the ocean. So when you're measuring LDL-C, you're measuring the cargo on all of these LDL subtypes they all have, one ApoB per particle, but you're not measuring the particles when you look at LDL-C. You're just looking at the cholesterol cargo on those particles. Whereas we can do things like particle studies to understand, okay, how many ships are actually in the water carrying that cargo. But ApoB is kind of where the cardiology world has landed more and more as like a simple kind of unified measure of, yes, we can still do particle studies to understand, are they large and fluffy and all that, but we've got this great proxy, not even a proxy, it's a direct measure of how many actual vessels, how many rafts are out on the water. And that matters because each one of those vessels contain one of those ApoB transport proteins that enable them to penetrate the vascular lining. So that is why the distribution of that cargo on these rafts, on these particles matters, is because it's that total exposure to ApoB that is so important in terms of driving your atherogenic risk.
Yes.
Would you agree with that analogy?
Yeah, And you know the thing about these lipid conversations is that the reason why people can get lost in the shuffle is because they're so hopelessly complex.
And
Mhm.
I
all the
mean,
acronyms and
the
the P's
world
and
the
C's
world
and
of lipidology is quite complicated when you start getting into like lipoprotein lipase and diffusion mediated and all these different types of it just gets very complicated. And
yeah.
I guess it's kind of a place where you kind of got to pick your shaman, right? Like everybody kind of has to pick a shaman, right? It's like you got to sort of say, all right, you know what? I have a working understanding of lipidology, and I know the markers that I think are important, and we've done our best to sort of like elucidate like a simplified version of why an ApoB particle moving through the vasculature can crash into an artery wall, as you said. It creates an immune response, and that's what drives plaque formation and potentially a rupture and stroke or whatever, heart attack. But to go and to try to have to digest that whole body of literature is very much a lifetime of work.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so, we're put in this situation where we have the democratization of biomarker data, we have the democratization of genomics data, we have such an incredible access to information. And we all go into these conversations, even on something as simple as YouTube, as really sheep among wolves, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
so
it's easy to manipulate when it's
it's
that complicated,
it's very easy, and that's the thing. You hear something like
consciously
that,
or not, you know?
right? And you hear something like the lipid energy model, right? I mean, and you think, wow, that's impressive. Like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, like the VLDL pathway is spinning so fast because of the consumption of dietary fat that the elevated LDL cholesterol is actually caused by remnant cholesterol. And you're like,
Mhm.
wow, that is like sharp. I mean, you
Well,
know,
even
yeah,
stepping back from that, you could just hear like LDL-C is inversely correlated with all-cause mortality. So, aha, like now I
right.
know. Like it's the you know enough just to get yourself in trouble. You actually have no idea how much you don't know, but you have enough to feel um artificially
Enough
confident.
to feel dangerous, right? And so, but
Yeah.
that's why. But this is a perfect segue because this is why a lot of these theories gain so much weight. It's like I chatted with, I'm friends with Dr. Joel Kahn, for example. Like he's a family friend, and I've had him on my
Nice.
YouTube channel here and there, and he's a very adamant ApoB plant-based advocate. His whole
Yeah.
life, he's been, he's appeared in movies like What the Health,
Yep.
and some others I've seen from afar that I don't know, but I've seen some of their work, like Dr. Ethan Weiss and some others. And, I mean, Dave Feldman was invited to speak at Stanford. There was real buzz for a time that, I would speak, like, for example, to like somebody like Dr. Khan, and you would kind of get the sense, I mean, he would never explicitly state this, but you kind of get the sense that people were starting to, there was so much smoke and there was so much buzz, right? That people were really starting to say, wait a minute, maybe it is true that, a large fluffy cholesterol, assuming all other biomarkers are pristine, is not atherogenic, and this is not an at-risk population.
Hmm.
That's why getting out of our sort of like biochemistry mapping, which is fun to do as an intellectual exercise, and like what a great thing to do, what a cool thing to learn about, what a fun thing to explore, right? But when you get to this keto CTA study, it's just like the musical chairs just stopped,
Yeah.
and it it's over. Like
Except they
it's
didn't stop for the authors, which is
no,
I
I
mean,
know, but yeah,
we
and the
And
can't.
some
thing,
of them are feeling
yeah,
remorseful.
it didn't stop for the authors, but it's like, man, I mean, what's that theme song of that one show, that old show? I'll probably age myself, but it's like making your way in the oh, it's Cheers.
It's
Making your way in the
Cheers,
world today
John.
takes everything you got. And it's tough. It's like living is tough. So
Mhm.
if you have received all this attention and you've lectured at these places and you're part of a group that's got all this money and funding and everything like that, and then your one study, which I think was sincerely believed would come to a different outcome, drops, and the data says that has to be really, really, really hard thing to do, to just walk away from that. Right? And so
I
you try to pick
guess.
up
I
the
mean,
wreckage, but
yeah,
there
it's
is
just
wreckage. The wreckage is undeniable. And the wreckage is in 1 year, people who were placed on this diet, who were lean mass hyperresponders. We don't know the exclusion criteria. We don't know how many people were excluded or why or whatever. And we thought we were going to have access to that information. They just had massive progression of really gnarly, really bad heart disease over a year. And it's just, that's it, period. And
Mhm.
so when you see that, you're just like, wow. The irony is it's actually kind of a gorgeous study, and there's no control group, and the primary outcome wasn't reported, and there's a lot of stuff that's not great, but that's that's an important data set to be able to point to and be like, hey, you young person that we just talked about a minute ago, who's eating your, steak and eggs and butter and whatever for breakfast, and your ApoBs at, like, God knows where, you are really actually, by lifestyle choice, putting yourself at a similar or greater risk than people who are like 65 years old who have like gout, type 2 diabetes, and like several other comorbidities. And your plaque progression is actually advancing at a rate that's higher than those people simply because of your diet ideology.
Yeah, I mean, John, I can't remember in the reading that I did, but you wrote a blog about this, right? Or it's on Gene Food's website. Like, if people, I'm sure we're going to keep talking about details, but if they want to see it in print, you talk about the kind of the outcomes of the study and comparing it, like you're saying, to these other studies that show populations that are diseased with less harmful progression.
Yes, but what I'm doing is I have a small audience, and we have a user base over the years, right? Like very small. And I'm
Be so
doing a
much bigger.
newsletter and all this kind of stuff. And like
Yeah.
I'm just this little, but what I'm doing is we're synthesizing. We're also building, we're building algorithms, right? We're
Right.
building into software algorithms to score people for diet traits and things like this. But I'm synthesizing for that, for my own benefit and for people that may come across the blog. And like, there's just a chorus of people. I mean, if you want to go look and just look at some of the tweets that
On Twitter, yeah,
somebody
it's a
like that, some of
nightmare.
these physicians sent, talking about not reporting the primary outcome. There were calls for retractions and censure. I mean, you could go on my blog and you can see the physicians. I quoted I think he's a Scottish or Irish
Okay.
physician
Oh, yeah.
who did a wonderful,
McGowan, yeah.
wonderful job just in 8 minutes describing this. It comes back to putting this message out so that hopefully there's some people who are like, oh, yeah, like, okay, I get it now. Like, I
And
don't want to do this to myself,
and and recognizing, yeah, it always drives me nuts too when we're like, oh, it's just some people that are saturated fat sensitive. Well, those some people are still people, and they're actually quite a large percentage of the population, and we just kind of brush it aside because it's not everybody. But there's also these really interesting double standards that are applied in some of these kind of counterculture nutrition spaces where our identity is based on kind of pushing back against mainstream and decrying, mainstream medical research and as being funded by pharma and everything. And you look at that study and you look at the funding, and it's actually funded by Citizen Science Foundation, which is
Yeah.
kind of, I mean, I think of it as Dave Feldman's like nonprofit organization. It's all completely is linked with Cholesterol Code, his website. But you don't hear a lot of the keto people who were so excited to finally say ApoB is not causal. You don't hear them being like, wait a minute, what's the funding on this study? And what's the method? It's just like we really, it was such an example of how willing or how capable we are, consciously or unconsciously, to apply double standards to confirm our biases.
Yeah.
yeah, I, you know, I agree with everything you said. And I mean, I think you can take up, it's before and after keto CTA. Before keto CTA, I think that there was this really interesting dialogue that was happening in the lipid community where a lot of people, were taking this. I don't think people were taking the lipid energy model all that seriously, but I think people were taking this idea that there could be a protective phenotype who are really insulin sensitive. And we now know that, at the hand of their own data, we know that there was actually a tremendous progression of heart disease. In terms of the people that are at home, who are on these protocols, I think one of the big reasons you guys mentioned, if you knew the risk, would you modify or would you not modify? And I think you guys both made excellent points. And the thing that I would say is, like, I think that there's a lot of people, Amanda made the point, is like, we're downplaying the sheer number of people that are saturated fat sensitive because it's quite numerous, right? There's a lot of people that fall into this bucket. But we're also downplaying the number of people who are just struggling at this very sort of like subclinical way with their health.
Mhm.
And I think that some people find themselves on these protocols for that reason, and they just find that they have just gotten all on the wrong side of their health, and they're reactive to all these different foods, and they figure, you know what? This is where I'm gonna go. I've noticed that for a week I feel better. When you're feeling that reactive and that unhealthy, feeling better for a week is like
Big
all that it's
deal.
really all
Yeah.
that matters, you know? So I think there is a certain desperation out there with certain people who fall into into these really bad places with their health, and no physician they're in a total blind spot of medicine. No doctor is going to help them, and they're like, oh my god, like what am I going to do to
And
make to feel better?
they're trying to still raise their kids and make a living,
Yeah.
and they don't have the time or skill set to do the deep dive into lipidemiology. I mean, that's just an unreasonable expectation. I don't blame the
Dude, I've been
influenced. I
saying this
blame
shit
the
for
grifters.
25 years and listened to the Atia podcast with Feldman, and I was like, I'm switching careers. Like, obviously, I have missed something in all of my study. I can't even imagine what somebody feels like at home.
You mean
Yeah.
switching careers as in I have no idea what's
Yeah,
going on here. I gotta
I'm
get
gonna be
out of
like a
here.
landscaper. I'm like, I obviously do not deserve to be in this field. I'm gonna go do something else because it is so complex. So yeah,
Yeah.
Amanda, to your point, it's like you go online and you see like a six-pack abs and John, I think like, is this where you would say like the autoimmunity piece might come in? Like you're saying, like people have kind of gotten on the wrong side of their health. Like I do want you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's related. It just kind of builds on the point that I just made, which is, you know, there are these. You guys can include this in the show notes if you want, but there's starting to be a little bit of movement around highlighting these issues. There's this paper that was published by researchers at University of Texas El Paso called "Toxicant-Induced Loss of Tolerance," and it basically talks about we're being exposed to all these evolutionarily novel compounds. Now, some people are
Mhm.
going to hear that and they're going to think, "Oh, EMF." I'm not talking about. I'm talking about literally like. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just there's a new, you know, the paleo movement's very concerned that we weren't designed to eat beans. Were we designed, you know, I lived in New York City for a long time, right? Like were we designed to eat, were we designed to breathe, you know, the traffic, you know, emissions on a normal New York City day, right?
Yeah, same.
As we
Right.
We
walk through
lived
New York
across the
City.
street from Cheers in Boston, like right where Sturo empties out into Back Bay. Like
Right?
our
And some
windowsills would be like black.
Yes,
Very
and some
different than
people are
bees.
gonna handle that. Some people are gonna handle that really well, and there's other people that are not gonna handle that as well. And I think a lot of the
Mhm.
people, or at least some of the people who find themselves in this camp are people who have been triggered in some way at at a deeper canonical level, like a deeper foundational level, and their immune system is just active, overactive, overactive. They
Mhm.
have some kind of smoldering autoimmune condition. And they find that when they remove some of these foods, right, that are demonized by you know, a lot of the people that are at the forefront really leading the charge on these diets are people who themselves have been very
Yeah.
public that they have been unfortunate to deal with their
Mhm.
own issues like this.
Yeah.
Mhm. I
And
see
so
what you're
I do
saying.
think that that's where the, you know, the smoldering autoimmunity piece kind of comes in. It's just um look, people are there's a certain class of people who's not well,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they're just
That's
looking
the
for they're charged with looking for their own solutions, and
yeah.
um,
And when your symptoms go away, you think that is a solution. And it is a stopgap. But I think people are mistaking stopgaps for solutions, and that is fueled by the grifter influencer culture. I think of it as influencer because I do think that a lot of people have good intentions. Like I
Mhm.
try to be as charitable as possible in my thinking, or else I really will have to change careers. But at this point, John, to me is like such an interesting inroad to talk about the lean mass hyperresponders and, you know, dyslipidemia associated with low carb, high fat, because the immunological piece that people experience with the food allergies and their reactions, and they just feel horrible and like that. It's like, that's really who this podcast is for. I think that was probably Amanda and I, would be my guess. And so we like stumbled into the world of, you know, like eating a stick of butter with
yeah,
every meal. I actually still have Butter Does a Body Better t-shirts for my clinical practice. That was in the mid 2000s. And then it's like they kind of get sucked in because they do feel better for a time. And yeah, just also have to live their life and raise their kids and all these things. But But yeah, because your symptoms go away, that doesn't mean that the problem is solved. It's one of the
Mhm.
biggest misconceptions in health. It's actually why we're upset at conventional medicine, but we're doing the same thing on our end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People think that quieting down their reactivity is like a longevity protocol.
Yes.
Quieting down your reactivity is not a longevity protocol. Quieting down your reactivity is just a temporary reprieve from something that's really bothering you at a foundational level, and it's not that's not the longevity protocol. The longevity protocol is, I've done newsletters on this. Like, you want to look at the people who are living a really long time. It's T. Colin Campbell and Caldwell Esselstyn. Those guys are
Mhm.
still alive into their 90s. Go look
Yeah.
up T. Colin Campbell and Caldwell Esselstyn.
Yeah.
Those guys are like
Plant-based.
92 years old and they're
Yeah.
like working on their farm and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not vegan. I think that's a whole can of worms. I don't want to get into the whole vegan. I think part of the vegan propagandizing vegan diets is part of what got us to this place with
Yeah.
the lean mass hyperresponder and low carb. But those guys, hey, if you're looking for somebody who's living a long time, I can point you in the direction of some skinny vegan physicians and researchers who seem to be doing pretty well. So
There
I
Yeah.
don't know.
is a there is a risk there in terms of logical fallacies that I see like on the other side of this camp as well, where and just it was reminding me. I was looking through the YouTube comments on the Feldman Atia testing, stress testing, the lean mass hyperresponder video where they really hashed it out, right? And there's people on there that are one of the comments was like, well, just look at Tom Dayspring. He's so unhealthy. And then look at
True.
Dave
Yeah.
Mhm.
Feldman. He's totally
Mhm.
vibrant. So,
Mhm.
clearly we should be following Dave's advice as opposed to like, well, some of these researchers, they're not following their own advice. They're
Mhm.
researching lipids and statistics and, data. So like there's that fallacy of, an appeal to appearance that I
Mhm.
think we have to be cautious about. But I do think also what you're saying is reflected in data that goes beyond n equals 1 as well.
It's like picking your trainer based off how they look. John, my husband, is a personal trainer and it drives him crazy. He's like these, linebackers I went to college with who became amazing trainers. They look like big, sloppy dudes and they're really like the most wonderful, nuanced trainers. But like everybody wants the guy that looks like a bodybuilder and it just doesn't work that way. Yeah, there's a question actually that I have. And do you all feel like there's like a really critical place that we need to go with the conversation next? Because I don't want to take us off path if that's the case.
I'm open to, yeah. I mean, you
Yeah, go
whatever you
ahead.
think.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
What's on your mind?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, like how to put the lean mass hyperresponder population in context for regular people, because it's my understanding that these folks are like extremely lean, as the name, suggests, which is one, just rare in the United States, at least. And then they are on this low carb, high fat diet, and they're having, this really exaggerated lipid response. It's just not many people that this applies to, but I'm thinking like we should explain it so that people can understand why this is so important. My guess that I'll like put my neck out a little bit. It's like if these people are having problems with a low carb, high fat diet and like they're sensitive to insulin, they're metabolically fit, they're, every other marker is perfect and they're having these problematic responses, then like Joe Blow is probably going to have like a really detrimental response,
Yeah,
possibly.
I think it's probably an issue where you just have to realize that, having issues with your heart health and your lipid markers is not tied to weight.
Mhm.
I mean, it's really separate from that. People think, oh, this person's lean and fit, so therefore their biomarkers all must look great, and not necessarily the case. There are people who we've said it. I mean, it's just so well documented across ApoE4, other markers. Family history, all these experiences. Just some people just have this reaction where, and it's well documented in that Atia Feldman interview. It's a Feldman interview, and many others. Is just we talk about. It's like, where did Moffat get his cholesterol? Where he's making more. There's
Mhm.
labs you can. It's a shame that there aren't more clinicians who run sterile panels, because
Mm.
a sterile panel will literally just do something very simple for you. It'll tell you whether you're making more cholesterol or whether you're absorbing more.
Right, right,
Yeah, and
right.
that absorption piece it's not just your diet, it's reabsorbing the cholesterol that was packaged into bile and sent into the lumen of the intestine, right? Because I thought that a lot of the cholesterols found in foods are actually have a much slower rate of absorption in the intestine than the actual sterols coming from the bile itself. Anyway,
I
that's
think
a
cholesterol absorption is that you're definitely reabsorbing your circulating pool. But then, one of the interesting things that those labs look at is they're actually not looking at any of the cholesterol because you can't identify what's endogenous and what's exogenous, what's eaten and what's made. So
Mhm.
therefore, they use plant sterols. And looking at the plant sterols gives you an idea of, how much cholesterol you're absorbing because they share the same pathway. And also,
Um,
phytosterols are quite bad for your heart to be absorbing. So, you can just go, if you're one of these people, you can just go find a physician that runs Boston Heart Diagnostics, get a sterile panel. You can do a genetic panel as well to get see what's transient and what's not. But you can just go get a sterile panel and you can see it's like, if I go on this high saturated fat diet and my desmosterol is like off the charts high, which is the first molecule in the cholesterol synthesis pathway, that means that I'm just making a ton more cholesterol. And that also tends to contradict the energy model, which says that, your VLDL is creating cholesterol, creating remnant cholesterol, which is causing this. There's really no evidence for that. What we see is that your body just starts making for some people, your body just starts making a ton more cholesterol when you go on a diet that's very high, especially in saturated fat.
Do we know why? I mean, I don't, obviously. Does anyone?
there can be
Mechanistically, I
several.
don't know why. I really don't. I mean, I don't. I know it's a
Interesting.
trait that's been observed in people and well documented for a long time now. Again, it was ironically, it was Dr. Tom Dayspring, who's sort of one of the biggest critics of, the keto CTA study in terms of saying that not reporting the primary outcome and, not having a control group and having it published in a credible journal that it should be retracted and all these different types of things. But he was actually the person who came up with that phrase, lean mass hyperresponder.
Mhm.
I just think, again, if you're just looking for something at home to just sort of like hang your hat on, it's just, you should get checked even if you have no issues with weight
Can
because
we run that study, like, or that test through BLT labs? There's all these different labs where people can order their own test, or would it be maybe like, I'm
you know,
curious on your opinion, like,
well,
should somebody work with a clinician?
probably. I mean, again, it's this theme of democratization. I mean, I did a Function Health panel just to
Mhm.
test it out and did a bunch of stuff with Function Health, which is Dr. Mark Hyman. He's like the spokesperson for it.
Yeah.
And they offer a lot of advanced labs, but they don't offer sterile panels. It's pretty
Huh.
rare. The one that I know that does a really great job with it and it's called their cholesterol balance test. And I like the interface and the way the results come out and all that kind of stuff is Boston Heart.
And
Yeah.
Victoria, going back to your question about if this is, wrecking the lipid or raising ApoB and insulin sensitive people, what's it doing to the average Joe? Completely depends on not only their genetics, but also where they're coming from metabolically. Because, if people have type 2 diabetes and are dyslipidemic because of pathology associated with type 2 diabetes, then a ketogenic diet could actually lower their lipids and correct a lot of, actually lower the
Mm.
risk in a lot of ways. But it's just going to depend person to person on what that ApoB number is going to do. But if it's really high from type 2 diabetes, it might drop. You might get more benefits. There's so much context around it all.
I guess it makes my question even more salient then, where it's like I wonder why. I didn't know about this topic, John, at all until Amanda introduced me to lean mass. I've been like moving. I live in Kentucky now, and I just was not on my radar at all. And so, like, when you told me about it, I was like, is it because it's like this compelling topic that people are so passionate about that it's like this one little group of lean people that are hyper responders to this diet? It's because in my mind, I'm like, okay, if I was practicing clinically, that would be like 1 out of 500 people that
It's
would walk into
because
the office.
it's because the whole keto world really kind of wanted it to prove the rule that ApoB was not atherogenic.
Yeah.
That's really
Okay,
what
got it.
they're, to like help them sleep better at night and to continue enjoying this diet that makes them feel better, function better, look better, improve a lot of markers, but comes with this potential major risk.
Problem.
And I think in terms of like the mechanism of why these diets, I think that it's like a multifold mechanisms why it's driving up LDL-C and ApoB in some people. Where, like, I know when your ketones can be like elevated ketone levels and elevated hepatic acetyl-CoA, which is kind of a step in the pathway to metabolic ketosis, can push up cholesterol synthesis in the liver. And then I think there is also something happening there with the saturated fat interacting with LDL receptors in the liver. And those LDL receptors are kind of functioning as a thermometer, and then the liver internally has the thermostat, so that those LDL receptors need to be able to bind to and take into the liver those LDL particles. And when it does that, not only does it allow it to potentially break down those particles, clear that cholesterol, but it also informs the liver, like, how much do I have out there circulating? And therefore, how much more do I want to produce and send out into circulation? So it's got this kind of thermostat, homeostatic, uh, function there. And when you are taking in a lot of saturated fat, for some people that really interferes with their LDL receptors' ability to perceive what's going on in terms of cholesterol homeostasis and act accordingly, and then reduces its clearance ability. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, John, but I think those are a couple of the potential mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds plausible. I just, one of the, like I
Yes,
said, I mean,
the mechanism.
the lipid conversations are, candidly, like I have a 4-year-old and so I have two kids that are 19 months apart at home. I have two little kids, and
Yeah.
like, I just, I think, like, with the level of sleep that I have at this moment, like, even getting into that extra layer of, biochemistry will, like, break my brain. I
Yeah, I feel you.
it's like, I hate to, so this is something where, again, it's like, you made a great point about the Colin Campbell thing, which you can't just take one person's experience and sort of say, okay, this is the shining example of all this kind of stuff. I do think that as you pointed out, the keto community kind of trotted out, especially Nick Norwitz, when he attached himself to the Feldman
Mm.
team, and Dr. Michael Budoff. These are two. I mean, Nick Norwitz is a Harvard. He's a Harvard medical student. I think he might be a Harvard MD right now. I mean, he's a very, very, very smart, very motivated, smart guy.
Accomplished.
And
Yeah.
Feldman
Michael
too,
Budoff,
it's
I mean,
brilliant.
he's and so they really wanted to trot these guys out as, like, their local, it's like the local champion for this, right?
The social proof for
Um,
it. Yeah.
and they got into a lot of the mechanistic stuff, and we can have these, there's all these interviews where people are talking about the biochemistry. Since
Yeah.
we're kind of ending the sort of nearing towards the end of the conversation, it's like, I think of Colin Campbell, and Colin Campbell did all this research on casein, and the potential cancer causing impacts of the proteins that are in dairy, right? And at the end of the day, like, I really stuck with me what he said, and I've repeated this before, but he said, I realized at one point that I wasn't looking at the mechanism, I was looking at a concert of mechanisms.
Mm.
And I feel
Mhm.
like we all talked about how we were kind of, like, recovering from this sort of, like, health and wellness, like, one phase of the health and wellness journey, which is very mechanistic, I think,
Yes.
right? Not
Mhm.
to say we can't, have fun and be masters of this, because it is
Yeah,
fun to
that's a
learn more, and
different
it's
way to
fun to
use
get
it.
your black belt, right? It's fun to try to get your black belt on lipids, and advance up, and it's a really fun intellectual exercise. But I think some degree of agnosticism to the mechanism across all of these topics is really useful, because it's just difficult to understand at any given time exactly what's going on in the body at that level of granularity,
I
Mhm.
you
think
know?
it's such an important point, and I think a good direction to kind of close this on is it's part of why it is so important, even though we get enthralled with the mechanisms and talking and following people who are talking about the mechanisms. It makes us feel like we're getting somewhere and we are able to participate in our own understanding. It's really important not to throw out the conclusions,
Right.
the findings from these large bodies of scientific experts who are actually looking more at outcomes-based data, and have such a larger view of the statistics. Because you hear that from the kind of Western medical world all the time of like, hey guys, we need to be looking at outcomes, not just mechanisms. It's a huge fallacy to forget that.
Yeah, can you still see me?
I can
We
hear
can
you,
hear
but you
you,
froze.
Okay, it seems
Frozen,
like I froze. Yeah. Okay.
but we can
Well,
hear you.
no, I mean it's a great point. That's kind of where I've come down on it again because you've mentioned several. You guys, I've heard you guys mention several times on this podcast, which is just like the theory of bandwidth. How much bandwidth do you really have? You know, and
Yeah.
so you have to pick and choose. And I found when I was at my most at the feeling the worst is when I was the most interested in mechanism. When I felt my
Mm.
worst, that's when I was the most mechanistically tuned in, and when I started to feel better is when I kind of just was like, okay, I'm gonna just have to surrender to some of this.
Yeah, I
Uh-huh.
think a lot of people have zoomed in and then they're like, whoa, 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 I got to zoom
Uh-huh.
back out to be okay.
Yeah, that's healthy. That is really a
Yeah.
piece, can be such a piece of healing, is letting go of this really powerful and potentially really stressful, like profoundly stressful need to figure it out. And I can be really, I just relate to that a lot. I've the number of times in my life that I've been up till 3 a.m. trying to dig through PubMed articles, trying to put together models that are actually that would take me lifetimes to figure out. They were way beyond my head, but the illusion that I was going to get there kind of continued to drive me to the point of not caring for myself and looking at the basic stuff of like, what are the relationships in my life looking? Oh, I'm
Mhm.
not sleeping because I'm reading this. What's my environment looking like? And what's, just kind of going back to these basics. And then also, um, relying on experts. I think we're just in a political environment too that is kind of anti-institution, anti-expert. And there's some reasons for that, and there's some edification I think we're going to take from this chapter in history, but it's also, I really personally want to continue to rely on experts for so much of this stuff.
Yeah.
And to know that we're not done with science. And this is kind of, I guess, at this point, a bit of a colloquialism, but just like research is alive and we're still young. And so humanity is still really just on the cusp of understanding so much, especially looking at your field, John, with nutrigenomics and understanding all these different polygenic, all these, where multiple genes are interacting together to influence health outcomes and risk. It's still so early. So just, I think for me in these conversations, so much of it's kind of stepping back from this assumption that we're going to get to some final thing to say, but rather to try to relax into the awareness that this is all just a big process that we're just witnessing and being part of. And it's just nothing is absolute or concluded. I mean, maybe that's too vague. Maybe that's being too vague, and there's some conclusions that can be made. But there's just this. I can get more excited about being in the field of nutrition when I try to take this approach of, boy, like we're all in this boat of discovery and exploration together. And there's no side that's like, they've been lying to us or we have the truth and you don't. It's like, it is just so in flux and in motion, in evolution. And that lets
Yeah,
me
Amanda,
hold
though,
everything
that
more
doesn't
lightly.
sell anything on
Does
Instagram
it?
or
It doesn't
TikTok.
sound
I'm
great.
sorry.
No.
That's true. It doesn't. You gotta. I mean, it is to that point. It is disappointing to see just how algorithmed things have gotten.
Yeah. But
So
John,
Yeah.
thank you for your time. This has been an amazing conversation.
yeah, sorry I froze up at the end there, guys, but I really love what you guys are doing, and I thank you for inviting me. I hope you have a great weekend, and let's stay in touch.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes,
Check out Gene Food, you
absolutely.
guys. It's great. It's absolutely worth diving in and exploring over there. Yeah.
Bye,
Thank you,
y'all.
John, for your clarity.
Thank you.
Bye.